For years I was a ghost, a shadow moving through places that didn't exist, carrying out orders that were never officially given. I worked in the dark so others could sleep peacefully, or at least that's what I told myself. I followed orders. I never asked why. That was the first mistake. The second was thinking I understood who I was working for. The third was believing any of it mattered. I died 7 minutes ago, clinically, medically, gone. But I didn't stay dead, and that's the problem. Because when I was gone, I saw something I was never meant to see. I woke up knowing the truth, and now they're watching me, waiting. Because men like me aren't supposed to come back. And if they do, they don't talk, but I will. Because whatever is coming, whatever I saw on the other side, it's already here. And no one is ready. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, it really helps. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss. I used to believe in power. Not in morality, not in justice, not in God, just power. The kind of power that moves nations, starts wars, and ends lives. I had seen it, wielded it, and understood its rules better than most. When you've spent years in covert operations, when you've executed missions that officially don't exist, you learn that the world isn't divided into good and evil. It's divided into the strong and the weak, the informed and the ignorant. I was among the strong, or at least that's what I thought. My work took me to places most people don't even know exist. I operated in the shadows, where there were no flags, no national anthems, just objectives. I did things that would make ordinary men recoil in horror, but I never flinched. Not because I was fearless, but because I had convinced myself that fear was a burden for lesser men. I followed orders without hesitation, and when you do that long enough, you stop questioning why. You just act. That changed the night I got the message. It was from an old contact, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. The kind of man who only reaches out when something is deeply, irreversibly wrong. "We need to talk, now." That was all it said. No details, no pleasantries. I felt something tighten in my gut. In my world, a message like that meant one of two things. Either someone was about to die, or someone already had. I checked my surroundings, my instincts kicking in. The street was quiet, too quiet. I had spent enough time in war zones to recognize when silence meant something worse than noise. I responded with a simple question: compromised? The answer came instantly. "You have no idea." A lifetime of discipline kept my pulse steady, but inside, I felt something I hadn't in years: unease. I had buried enough bodies, erased enough names, and silenced enough voices to know when a storm was coming. I just didn't know yet if I was the one being hunted, or if I was already dead and just too stubborn to realize it. I left my apartment without hesitation, taking only what I needed: burner phone, sidearm, cash. My contact had sent an address: a bar on the outskirts of town, a place where conversations never left the room. When I arrived, I scanned every face, every exit. Years of training don't just disappear. He was already there, sitting at a corner booth, looking like a man who had seen something he wished he could forget. "You look like hell," I said, sitting across from him. "You will too," he replied, "when you know what I know." I waited. He took a breath, exhaled slowly. "You ever wonder who we really work for?" It was such a ridiculous question that I almost laughed. Almost. But something in his expression stopped me. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't regret. It was something worse. "You're telling me we're not working for who we think we are?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He shook his head. "I'm telling you we never were." For the first time in my life, I felt something colder than fear. I had spent years eliminating threats, following chains of command without question, and now, sitting across from a man whose hands were just as dirty as mine, I was being told that everything I thought I understood was a lie. "How deep does it go?" I asked. He stared at me, his fingers tightening around his glass. "It doesn't stop." The weight of those words settled over me like a noose tightening around my throat, and in that moment I realized something. The most dangerous thing I had ever done wasn't pulling a trigger, infiltrating enemy lines, or carrying out an assassination. The most dangerous thing I had ever done was trust. I left the bar with the weight of his words pressing against my ribs like a loaded gun. The city felt different. It was the same streets, the same flickering streetlights, the same distant hum of late-night traffic, but something in the air had changed. It was heavier, thicker, charged with an energy I couldn't quite place. I had spent years moving unnoticed through places most people never knew existed, but tonight, for the first time in a long time, I felt like prey. I walked toward my car, keeping my pace steady, resisting the urge to look over my shoulder. My instincts were screaming at me, the way the neon glow of a diner sign reflected off a windshield across the street, the barely perceptible movement in a nearby alley, the flicker of a cigarette ember just out of sight. None of it was overtly threatening, but it was wrong. Too much silence. Too much stillness. I slid into the driver's seat, shut the door, and started the engine, letting the low rumble settle me. My hands remained steady on the wheel, but my mind raced. What had I just walked into? My contact hadn't given me specifics, just a cryptic warning that sounded more like the ramblings of a man who had seen too much. But something about his words stuck with me. You ever wonder who we really work for? It was ridiculous. I had been doing this job long enough to know exactly how things worked. There was a chain of command, there were directives, and there were objectives. That was it. It was clean, simple. But the look in his eyes told me otherwise. That wasn't paranoia I saw. It wasn't regret. It was something worse. I checked my mirrors. A black SUV sat parked 2 cars back. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it felt obvious, like it was always meant to be there, waiting for me to see it. The windows were tinted, the engine off, but I could feel the weight of unseen eyes. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was exactly what I thought it was. I pulled out onto the road, keeping my speed natural, blending into the rhythm of the city. The SUV didn't move at first, but when I reached the next intersection and turned left, it followed. Another turn, it followed again. I forced my pulse to stay steady, my breathing even. This wasn't the first time someone had followed me, but this was different. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. I took another turn, sharper this time, moving through a side street with little traffic. The SUV mirrored me, keeping just enough distance to avoid suspicion, but close enough that I knew this wasn't a coincidence. I glanced at the fuel gauge. Half a tank. Enough. My fingers tightened around the wheel. I wasn't about to let this play out on their terms. I accelerated, weaving through traffic, watching for patterns in their movement. They didn't panic, they didn't hesitate. Whoever was driving was trained. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't some random surveillance team. This was an operation, and I was the target. I took the next exit onto the freeway, pushing the speed limit, watching as another black SUV merged in from the opposite ramp. My stomach tightened. 2 vehicles. That meant coordination. That meant planning. That meant I was in real trouble. The first shot shattered my rear windshield, spraying glass across the dashboard. Civilians on the road had no idea what was happening, swerving, honking, trying to get out of the way. Another round of gunfire hit the back of my car, punching through metal with sickening precision. They weren't just trying to scare me, they were trying to end this quickly. I reached under my seat, my fingers finding the familiar grip of my pistol. My car was fast, but speed wasn't going to save me. I had to change the rules. I swerved hard to the right, clipping the edge of another vehicle and sending it spinning into traffic. The chaos bought me a few seconds, but not enough. More bullets tore through my back tires, and I felt the loss of control instantly. The car skidded, fishtailed, and then I was spinning, the world turning into a blur of headlights and concrete. The impact came all at once. Metal screeching, my body slamming against the seatbelt, pain blooming across my ribs as the air was knocked from my lungs. Silence followed. A strange, ringing silence, where the only sound was the distant wail of sirens and the crackling of something burning. My vision swam, darkness creeping at the edges, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then hands grabbed me, rough, gloved hands pulling me from the wreckage, dragging me onto the cold pavement. My body protested, every nerve screaming, but I forced myself to stay conscious. A boot slammed into my chest, pinning me down, and I felt the press of a knee against my back. I tried to fight, twisting, but another blow caught me across the jaw, and the taste of blood filled my mouth. A shadow loomed over me. A figure crouched down, their face blurred by the haze of pain and adrenaline. They weren't panicked, they weren't rushed. They had all the time in the world. "You should have stayed in the dark," the figure said, voice calm, almost amused. I spat blood onto the pavement, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "You should have tried harder." They smiled, and then everything faded to black. There was no pain, no air, no sound. Just a deep, endless void stretching beyond comprehension. At first, I thought I was unconscious, trapped in that strange limbo between waking and dying, but this was different. I wasn't floating, I wasn't falling, I simply was. The blackness was absolute, swallowing everything, even thought itself. There was no sense of time, no heartbeat, no body, just silence. Was it just failing? Just silence. I suspected that silence could sound the same. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like the wind moving through distant corridors, too soft to decipher but impossible to ignore. They weren't coming from any one direction, they were everywhere, and they were growing louder. My instincts screamed at me to move, to reach for my weapon, but I had no body, no hands, nothing to fight with. Panic surged through me, but it had nowhere to go. I was trapped in something beyond my understanding. The whispers turned into voices, hundreds, maybe thousands, overlapping, murmuring, hissing words I couldn't make sense of. But then, slowly, they started forming into something recognizable. My name. Over and over, different tones, different mouths, calling me, dragging me deeper. Some voices I recognized, some I didn't. A woman I had killed in Damascus, a soldier I had left behind in the jungle, a child from a burning village whose face I had forced myself to forget. They weren't speaking in anger. That was the worst part. They were simply calling. A faint light appeared in the distance. Not bright, not warm, just a thin sliver cutting through the void. It flickered like a dying flame, too weak to push back the darkness around it. But I had nothing else, nowhere else to go. So I moved toward it, not with my legs, not with effort, but with something deeper, something instinctive, like I was being pulled. The voices followed, whispering, pressing against me like unseen hands. The light grew, the darkness thinned. Shapes began to form, shifting, melting into one another. For a moment, I thought I saw the silhouette of a doorway, impossibly tall and narrow, carved from something older than time itself. Then it changed, stretching outward into something else. An open field beneath a sky that didn't belong to any world I knew. The stars above weren't stars at all, but burning shapes moving in patterns too precise to be random. The ground beneath me was solid but not quite real, shifting between stone and sand with every breath I didn't take. Then I saw them. Figures standing in the distance, motionless, waiting. They weren't human, not in the way I understood. Their faces were obscured, blurred, as if reality itself refused to define them, but their presence was undeniable. I had spent years facing down the worst of humanity, but nothing had ever made my blood run cold like this. I knew, somehow, that they had been waiting for me, and I knew that this wasn't a dream. I tried to speak, to demand answers, to ask where I was, but no words came. My voice didn't exist here. One of the figures took a step forward, and the moment it moved, I felt something inside me twist, like a hook embedded in my soul being pulled tight. My mind screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was already caught. The figure lifted a hand, and the entire landscape shifted. The sky rippled, the stars bled, the ground beneath me became liquid and solid all at once, and then, in a blink, I was no longer standing in the strange shifting field. I was somewhere else. Somewhere familiar. A corridor. A long, sterile hallway lined with metal doors. I knew this place. I had walked these halls. I had given orders here. It was a classified facility buried deep beneath a desert no map acknowledged, but that was impossible. It had been years I had left this place behind, yet here I was, standing in a past I couldn't have returned to. One of the doors creaked open, and the light inside flickered, casting shadows along the walls. I knew what was behind that door before I even stepped inside. The memory hit me like a hammer, the cold steel table, the restraints, the blood. I had been here before. I had been the one standing over that table, giving orders, asking questions no one wanted to answer, and the man strapped to that table had been real. He had begged, he had screamed, and then he had stopped. Now he was sitting up, eyes open, looking right at me. His face was exactly as I remembered. The bruises, the split lip, the empty stare of someone who had nothing left to give. But he wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to exist anymore. I had made sure of that. "You remember me?" he said. Not a question, a statement. I couldn't answer, my voice was still gone. "You thought this place was buried. You thought the things you did here wouldn't follow you." His eyes darkened, hollowed, something moving behind them that wasn't human. "But you never really left, did you?" I took a step back. The air was wrong, thick, pressing in from all sides. The walls began to pulse, the metal warping, shifting like something alive. The man on the table stood, but his restraints never came off. He moved as if the chains were still there, dragging behind him, rattling with every step. "You were given power," he said, "and you used it." A sound rose in the distance. A deep, grinding roar, like the earth itself was groaning. The walls cracked. Darkness spilled from them, thick and slow, seeping like ink. "You thought you were in control," the man whispered, his voice splitting into something layered, something more than one voice speaking at once. "You thought you knew who you served." The light flickered, the room twisted, the darkness lunged, and then everything collapsed. The darkness swallowed me whole. There was no falling, no sensation of movement, just an abrupt shift. One moment I was standing in that room face to face with the impossible, and the next I was somewhere else entirely. At first I thought I was blind, then I realized it wasn't my sight that had failed. It was the world itself that had no form. No walls, no floor, no sky. Just an absence of everything, stretching in every direction. I wasn't floating, I wasn't standing. I simply existed in a place where existence itself felt like a mistake. Then, a voice. It wasn't like the whispers before. It wasn't layered, wasn't twisted with malice or sorrow. It was singular, absolute, cutting through the void with a clarity that made every part of me tense. "You are not supposed to be here." It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned, though I had no body to turn with, and suddenly there was light. It wasn't a blinding flash, it was slow, creeping in like the first crack of dawn after an endless night. Shapes emerged, shadows stretched, pulling themselves into definition. And then I saw it. A mirror. It stood alone in the void, towering, impossibly vast, its frame carved with symbols I didn't recognize, yet somehow understood. The surface wasn't glass. It was liquid, swirling like black mercury, shifting between states of reflection and distortion. I didn't want to look. Every instinct in me screamed to turn away, to run, to fight. But there was nowhere to go. "Look," the voice commanded. I didn't want to, but I did. At first, I saw nothing, just shifting darkness, rolling like storm clouds beneath the surface. Then, slowly, images formed, fragments of my life, played out in perfect, terrible clarity. I saw my first kill, the moment that should have meant something but had only been another step forward in my training. I saw the operations I had led, the orders I had followed, the lives I had erased with the pull of a trigger or the nod of my head. I had always told myself it was necessary, that it was justified. But the mirror showed something else. I saw the faces of the men, women, and children left in the wake of my missions. I saw grief. I saw fear. I saw destruction. I saw the moments after the reports were written. after the bodies were counted, after the names had been scrubbed from existence. I had thought of them as ghosts, faceless, nameless figures that had no weight beyond the mission. But now, they looked at me, not with anger, not with vengeance. They looked at me with something worse, recognition. You believed in control, the voice continued, in structure. You believed that what you did was necessary. The images shifted. I saw myself in boardrooms, in briefing sessions, in darkened halls where decisions were made over maps and intelligence reports. I saw myself justifying actions, stripping people of their humanity with language designed to cleanse the blood from my hands. Threat neutralized, collateral damage, acceptable loss. You were given power, the voice said. You used it without question, and now you see. The mirror changed again. The reflections no longer showed the past. They showed something else, something I had never seen before, but had always felt beneath the surface. It was the truth I had never dared to acknowledge. I saw the chains, not literal ones, not metal shackles, but they were there, wrapped around me, stretching beyond sight, pulled by unseen hands. They had been there my entire life. I just had never looked. The missions I had taken, the choices I had made, they had never been mine. I had followed orders. But the orders had never come from where I thought they had. You served without knowing who you served. The weight of the words pressed down on me like a physical force. The mirror darkened, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then the image changed one final time. I saw myself, not as I was, but as I could have been. A life where I had walked away. A life where I had questioned, where I had stopped before it was too late. A life where I had not let the chains pull me deeper. You were never meant to wake up, the voice said. But now you have, and now you must choose. The void around me trembled, the mirror cracked, and then everything shattered. The world collapsed around me. The mirror shattered into infinite fragments, but instead of falling, they rose, swirling, twisting, merging into something I couldn't comprehend. The darkness shrank away, replaced by something vast and endless. A horizon that stretched in every direction yet felt like it was closing in at the same time. The air here was thick, vibrating with something just beyond perception. It wasn't heat, wasn't cold, just presence. Like something ancient had turned its attention to me, waiting. Then the voice returned. You have seen what was. Now you will see what will be. The ground beneath me was suddenly no longer solid. I was falling, but there was no wind, no sense of descent, just a shift. The horizon bent, twisted, and then I was somewhere else. A city. But not any city I recognized. It was endless, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. Towering buildings made of something dark and gleaming, pulsing with an unnatural glow. The streets were empty, no people, no movement, just silence. And then, as if responding to my thoughts, figures emerged from the shadows. They weren't people, not entirely. At first glance, they looked human, men, women, children, but their eyes were wrong, hollow, empty, like something had stripped them of everything that made them real. They moved in perfect synchronization, their steps soundless, their mouths slightly open as if whispering something just beyond hearing. I turned, and suddenly I wasn't alone. A figure stood beside me, not the faceless presence from before. This was different, more defined, cloaked, but radiant. I couldn't see a face, but I felt something emanating from it. Not warmth, not cold, just gravity, like it was something too vast to comprehend, compressed into a form I could barely tolerate looking at. This is what comes next, it said. I didn't speak, didn't ask questions. I only watched as the world before me shifted again. The sky darkened, the glow of the buildings pulsed faster, flickering erratically, and then, from above, something descended, At first I thought it was a storm, black clouds rolling in, swallowing the skyline, but then I saw the shapes, moving, writhing, shifting through the air like living shadows. They weren't human. They weren't anything I had words for. They didn't fly. They poured down, slipping through the sky like ink dissolving in water, spreading, consuming. The figures in the streets didn't run. They didn't scream. They simply stood, waiting. And then the screaming began. Not from the figures, but from something else. The buildings themselves, the air, the world. It screamed. And suddenly, the silent figures collapsed. Their bodies contorted, twisted, reshaped into something unnatural, not dead, changed. Their empty eyes ignited with something deep and violent, something older than anything I had ever known, and then, as one, they turned. Not toward the sky, not toward the things descending, toward me. I took a step back. It was instinct, useless, meaningless, but instinct nonetheless. The cloaked figure beside me remained still. "This is not a war," it said. "It is a harvest." The ground beneath the city split. The buildings trembled, not from destruction, but from something rising beneath them. Great machines, vast and unknowable, churning, shifting, feeding on the very fabric of reality itself. The sky tore open, revealing not stars, not space, but something else. A presence. Something looking back. I turned to the figure beside me. "What is this?" My voice was hoarse, raw, like I had been screaming without realizing it. The figure finally moved, raising an arm, pointing toward the center of the city where the darkness was thickest. "This is what has been built. This is what they have always worked toward. The world you serve does not belong to you. It never did." I wanted to deny it. I wanted to argue, but the images flashed through my mind before I could even form the words. The orders I had taken, the missions I had carried out, the governments, the wars, the alliances that never made sense unless you saw them from this angle, unless you understood what was truly being cultivated. I thought of the men I had worked for, the ones who sat in rooms no one knew existed, making decisions that shaped the world. I had always believed they were the top of the chain. That power, real power, rested with them. But I had been wrong. They weren't at the top. They were servants, just like I had been, just like we all had been. The city burned, but not with fire. It burned with something deeper, something that consumed, not destroyed. It spread outward, past the city limits, across landscapes I couldn't see. There was no escaping it, no fighting it. This was beyond war, beyond resistance. I sleeping. "Each one is a choice," the figure said. The words sent a shudder through me. "You can go back. You can forget. You can continue playing your part, pretend this was nothing more than a dream, a moment of weakness. And when the time comes, you will stand among them, silent, waiting, hollow." The figures in the street moved again, twitching, shifting, waiting. Or you could wake up, truly wake up. The city trembled. The sky cracked. I felt it then, the pull, the force that had bound me my entire life, the chains I had never seen but had always been there. They tightened, resisting, trying to hold me in place. The figure watched, waiting. I knew what it was asking. I had spent my entire life following orders, never questioning, never hesitating. But now, for the first time, the choice was mine. And I had to make it. I woke up with a gasp, my body seizing as air rushed into my lungs like I had never breathed before. The pain hit me all at once, sharp, burning, radiating from every nerve as if my flesh had been torn apart and stitched back together wrong. My chest heaved, my muscles convulsed, and for a moment I had no idea where I was. The world around me was a blur of sterile light, beeping monitors, the distant murmur of voices. My vision swam, dark spots clouding the edges. And then clarity. A hospital room, white walls, tubes snaking into my arms, machines monitoring my pulse. I wasn't supposed to be here. The last thing I remembered was standing at the edge of something vast, something beyond comprehension, faced with a choice I barely understood. And now I was back. in a body that felt like a cage. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision. Someone was standing at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, posture tense. It took me a second to place him. A doctor, maybe mid-50s, graying at the temples, his eyes sharp with something between shock and calculation. "You shouldn't be alive," he said. His voice barely registered over the pounding in my head. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw, my mouth dry as dust. I forced myself to swallow, to push through the fog clouding my brain. "How long?" My voice came out rough, barely a whisper. The doctor hesitated. "You were clinically dead for 7 minutes." 7 minutes. My mind reeled. I had been gone longer than that. I had seen more than could fit into minutes, into hours, into anything measurable. Time hadn't existed where I had been. 7 minutes meant nothing. "You should have suffered brain damage," the doctor continued, studying me like I was something unnatural. "No oxygen to the brain for that long. You shouldn't even be speaking right now." I could feel it, the way he was looking at me, the way the air in the room felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. They had expected a corpse. Instead, I was sitting up, alive, awake. But I wasn't the same. A movement caught my attention beyond the glass window of the room. 2 men stood just outside, dressed in suits, their expressions unreadable. Not doctors, not family. Their presence was wrong, too deliberate. They weren't here out of curiosity. They were here for me. I forced my body to move, to push past the pain, the stiffness, the lingering weight of something that wasn't quite real. The doctor reached out, maybe to stop me, maybe just out of instinct, but I ignored him. My fingers found the IV in my arm, and I pulled, feeling the sting, the warmth of blood trickling down my skin. The machines beeped wildly in protest. "You need to lie down," the doctor said sharply. "You've just come back from—" I swung my legs over the side of the bed, every muscle screaming in protest, but I pushed through it. "Who are they?" I asked, nodding toward the men outside. The doctor's jaw tightened. "They said they were with the government." Of course they did. I had seen this before. I had been on the other side of this scenario too many times not to recognize it for what it was. I was an anomaly now, a problem that needed to be assessed, contained, controlled. Whatever had happened to me, whatever I had brought back, it wasn't something they could just let walk out of here. One of the men outside spoke into a radio. The other turned toward the door. They were coming in. I moved before I could think, years of training overriding the haze in my mind. My feet hit the cold tile, my balance wavered, but I caught myself. The hospital gown was a problem. Barefoot, unarmed, vulnerable, but I had been in worse situations. The doctor took a step back, his expression shifting from concern to alarm. "You need to—" The door swung open. The 2 men entered, moving with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing they have control of the situation. "Sir," one of them said, his voice measured, authoritative. "We need you to come with us." I didn't respond. I just stared at them, my mind working through the possibilities. If they were government, they weren't just here to debrief me. If they were something else, I had even bigger problems. Either way, I wasn't going with them. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of my own existence settle over me like a second skin. I had made a choice back there, in the place that wasn't a place. I had chosen to wake up, but now that I had, I was starting to wonder if that had been the right decision. "You don't know what you brought back with you," one of the men said as if reading my thoughts. "But we do." A cold certainty settled in my gut. I had seen what was coming. I had seen the truth beneath the surface of everything I had once believed in. And now, standing in a hospital room with 2 strangers who thought they had control over me, I realized one thing with absolute clarity. They were afraid. Not of me, of what came next. I didn't go with them. Not because I thought I could run, not because I believed I could fight my way out of a hospital room half-drugged, barefoot, and barely able to stand. I didn't go with them because I knew the truth. And so did they. The moment stretched between us, a silent understanding settling into the air. They had seen this before, not often, but enough. Enough to know that when someone came back, truly came back, they weren't the same. Something shifted behind their eyes. The kind of hesitation that only men who are used to having absolute control feel when they realize they might not. "You can't stop it," I said. My voice was hoarse, raw, but steady. "It's already happening." The taller one, the one who had spoken first, kept his face neutral, but his fingers twitched at his side. The other exhaled through his nose, like he had heard this before and was already tired of the conversation. "You don't know what you're saying," he replied, measured, careful. "You've been through a traumatic event. You need time to process. But we need to make sure you're safe, that everyone is safe." I almost laughed. Safe. That word didn't mean anything anymore. Not after what I had seen. Not after the city, the sky, the things that moved in the spaces between reality, waiting, watching. Not after the chains. The realization that I had spent my entire life following orders that had never come from the people I thought they had. "You think you can contain this?" I said, watching them both closely. "You think this is just another operation, a problem you can manage?" I shook my head. "You're wrong." The first man stepped forward, his patience running thin. "This isn't up for debate." I looked past him, past both of them, to the window, to the world beyond the glass. The city stretched out in the early morning light, skyscrapers catching the sun, traffic moving like nothing had changed. But I knew better. Something had shifted. Something had cracked. The world wasn't the same. It just didn't realize it yet. I turned back to them, exhaling slowly, feeling the weight of everything settle into my bones. "You can take me in, lock me up, study me, silence me. It won't change anything. You're just men playing a game you don't even know the rules to." The taller man's jaw clenched. "Then tell us." I let the silence stretch. For a moment I considered it, telling them everything. The visions, the truth, the future unraveling thread by thread. But what would it change? They wouldn't believe me. Even if they did, it wouldn't matter. The machine they served, the one I had served, didn't care about truth. It only cared about control. And this was beyond control. I pushed myself up, ignoring the way my muscles protested, the dull ache in my skull. I looked them both in the eye, steady, unwavering. "You think you're ready for what's coming?" My lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're not." Neither of them spoke. I walked past them, my steps slow, deliberate. No one stopped me. Not the doctors, not the nurses, not the men in suits who had come to collect me. They just watched. I stepped out of the hospital into the cold morning air, the city stretching before me. It looked the same, ordinary, normal, but I could feel it. The shift, the crack beneath the surface. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.